Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this webcast. It's my privilege to be speaking with Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who led the 2018 House of Lords report on AI. And so, Tim, thank you so much for joining us in this. For our people who are watching, listening this, perhaps we should just start with giving a brief portrait of yourself, just so people know where you're coming from, and I'll do the same.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Brief portrait. I currently am the digital spokesman for the Lib Dems and the Lords, but really what I've done an awful lot of is on an all-party basis. So, for instance, I set up the all-party AI group back in 2016 because I was concerned that parliamentarians didn't really have a handle on the future of AI, the ethics of AI, the application of AI, and so on. And then, as chance had it, the House of Lords set up a special inquiry into artificial intelligence and asked me to chair it. So I've kind of lived, eaten, breathed AI since then. And then I fell into the company of Sir Anthony Seldon after his book came out, The Fourth Education Revolution, and he asked me to chair the advisory council of the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, and that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years, as well as all the other activities, which include working with the OECD, the Council of Europe, and so on. So it's been a total immersion, basically, for quite some period of time now.
Thanks, Tim. And so, give a brief portrait of myself. I've been involved in education all my life, education and technology in particular, and for almost a decade now, I've been looking at the implications of AI for education. And I come at it kind of a bit of a skeptic, if I'm honest. I think there's long-term potential, but at the moment, I don't think we're necessarily doing good things. A couple of things. I led the publication of a book called Artificial Intelligence in Education, Promises and Implications for Teaching and Learning. And then I've been working with UNESCO, in particular, helping them put together guidelines for policymakers about the ways in which AI and education are kind of coming together in interesting ways around the world. And so I wondered, to start our conversation, I thought it might be a good idea just to start with the really easy topic, Tim, if that's all right with you. And, you know, built into the notion of AI, artificial intelligence, is this concept of intelligence. So with all your experience and all the people you've been speaking to and the things you've seen, what's your thoughts at the moment? Do you think AI is intelligent?
Oh, good, very good question. I think it can be extremely smart, actually, because it can do things incredibly fast, which I think in terms of analysis, humans would find they'd be quite a bit slower at. I think sometimes you can come across new perceptions. I mean, the AlphaGo example of Move 37, for example, which actually changed the way that humans play Go, I think is a very good example of where AI can give new perceptions. But I see it mainly not as a self-standing tool, if you like. I see it as something that humans can use and augment what they do. I believe that that is the most powerful use of AI. I mean, people tend to think of robots and so on, what you might call embedded AI, but actually, I think that using it to augment human activities, particularly in this context, teaching and learning, I think is the most powerful aspect. So I think you've got to combine it if humanly possible. That's a strange expression I know to use in this context, but if humanly possible, I think you should combine it, and then you get the best of all worlds. You get the empathy, of the human, and you get the, if you like, the analysis of the AI and the prediction quality of the AI. So I think it's a very powerful combination potentially.
And what about the kind of a bit of the overselling? You know, I've attended the APPGs that you chair, and we often hear things that are, shall I say, perhaps very confident. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think you have to be eternally skeptical. And this is one of the problems about AI, that if you're not careful, people get so excited about the opportunities, they forget the ethical application issues. Now, I'm a great believer in making sure that when you are looking at the opportunities, you also make sure that you're looking at the risks at the same time. And that was what our select committee really majored on in a big way, and I've carried that through. So I think, you know, I think you've just got to be quite measured about these things. I mean, I do believe that AI, you know, can resolve quite a number of issues in resource terms, and to that extent could be an extremely effective way of, if you like, evening up, leveling up social mobility and so on, in terms of giving more resource where it can be used, you know, effectively by people who historically have not had all the resources in the education field. So, you know, but at the same time, you know, you've got to be very clear about how you use it and the ethics of using it. So I think, again, you know, we just don't get overhyped on these things, but we just are very evidence-based, and we make sure that that it's applied in the proper fashion.
Yeah, I'm brought to mind the recent GPT-3 that was released by the OpenAI companies it now is in the States. And some of the things it's been producing have been interesting to say the least. And, you know, the way it does it in terms of the string of words to make a sentence can be, you know, completely accurate and useful, etc. But then when it strings sentences together, it quickly seems to go off on its own tangent. And, you know, one of the examples was the notion, if you add cranberry juice to another juice, and what happens there, and the GPT-3 says that will kill you. So it's kind of got, it is incredibly impressive, and what the scientists are doing with this is amazing, and the connections they're making. But it still seems to me that we're a long way from actually being able to, you know, even have a conversation. We've all got, you know, perhaps our Alexas or our Google Homes, but actually you can't have a conversation with it. You can bark a command, and hopefully most often it understands. So do you think that's going to change anytime soon?
Funny enough, I do think that as time goes on, these things of that kind of natural language processing does move on. I mean, you used the example of the GPT-3, but then just a couple of years ago, we had the Tay chatbot, which ran out of control. And I mean, I agree with you that you've got to be very careful. That's why I'm a great believer in the human in the loop. And of course, the EU has made it one of their kind of cardinal principles in terms of regulation and so on. Future regulation, we're not there yet. So I do think that's important. But you look at the way that, for instance, Google Translate has improved over the years. That is now a really pretty impressive translation tool. So this natural language, that particular area of AI, I think is moving very fast, actually. And, you know, some of the GPT-3 stuff is quite impressive. And I see that Microsoft have now taken a license. And so again, they obviously think this is something worth investing in. Yeah.
So should we move into the world of education? You've mentioned it a couple of times, and this is really the focus. So in our conversations, we know, you know, AI is coming into education in many different ways. So the question I'd like to put to you is, what do you think is the most exciting ways? What are you most looking forward to about the application of AI in educational contexts?
Well, I think it's two things. I've mentioned the social mobility aspect because I think that AI, I mean, it's not just AI, it's other forms of technology potentially, but can actually help level up because, where you've got expensive resource, it may be possible to use technology to actually augment what is an expensive resource and make better use of it in a sense, where you're talking about the state system, state education system, and so on, compared to private schooling. So I think there's opportunity there. But so you've got a kind of social purpose there, which I think is potentially exciting. But I also think that there is a learner excitement. So I think that's the second one, where, and I mean, I've read, quite a bit of what you've published on the subject, and I mean, I agree. I think it's not just about, this isn't just about kind of passing exams or, that sort of, I don't regard that as education in the wider sense. I think it's developing qualities, resilience and curiosity and those sorts of creativity, those kinds of features, which actually I think with the right kind of AI, you can help develop. And I think the third thing is, I think you can help teachers actually enjoy what they do to a much greater extent. You can get rid of some of the drudgery, the timetabling, some of the assessment. They can, be augmented in that respect. So I think there are, there's a broader one. There's the learner and there's the teacher. So I do think that there is opportunity there. But we've just got to make sure that when it's developed, this isn't some sort of top-down type of technology, but it's actually developed with the people who are going to deploy it very much and be the subject of it very much in mind.
I completely agree with everything you just said. I think, for me, in my experience, the vast majority of the effort that we've seen in AI and education over the past 5 or 6 years in a commercial setting, but probably 30 years in the academic setting, is tools that will do tutoring. And personally, I'm not 100% convinced by those tools for a host of reasons. And I'm, as you mentioned, I'm much more interested in AI augmenting and helping people. So, one notion that we've talked about many times is the idea of an AI-empowered learning companion that supports the student to learn what they wish to learn, rather than attempting to do the job of the teacher. And in many of my presentations, I've got to the point I said, so what about teacher-facing AI in education? And I can't find any. I actually now have found one, which is IBM's Teacher Advisor, it's called. And the idea is you can go to their website and you can pop in a topic that you wish to teach, and it will generate a list of resources to support you in that. Now, on the one hand, I think that's terrific because it's using AI to help the teacher to be a stronger teacher, which I think is a very, very good thing. But on the other hand, I've tried this system, and it's not that good at the moment, but I think it has potential. It definitely has potential.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you've only found one, because I think there is sort of back office AI, which has begun to be quite helpful. But it's interesting that that's the only one you've been able to find in terms of actual teaching tools for teachers.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the things, areas that I've been going on about for a long time is examinations. Now, I've done well in my later life, but I did really poorly in exams at school, and all the evidence I've looked at, I'm not convinced that they're the right way to assess and accredit our students' learning. And so a long time we've been talking about, well, perhaps we can get rid of exams and replace them with AI using continuous AI-driven monitoring. The problem with that, though, Tim, is it suddenly realised one day that I'm talking about student surveillance. And I'm not convinced that student surveillance is a good thing. And we know lots of examples of facial recognition systems and mind EEG type systems that are monitoring what students are doing. And I'm not convinced by that. But I do wonder whether there is a role. And I think in a sense, what we experience with the GCSEs and A-levels difficulties, shall we say, this year, points to it, doesn't deal with it by a long way, but I happen to believe that teachers are very good at what they do. And I think there are ways in which we can use AI to support teachers to do assessment and accreditation in more robust ways. And I think that's a whole big area that's not being really explored at the moment.
Yes, I mean, you were very polite about the A-level fiasco this year. I mean, the trouble is, you know, those algorithms give AI a bad name, and I'm not sure that they really were AI in that sense. Certainly, the weighting of the algorithm was rather extraordinary in giving so much preference to the teacher ranking. But you're quite right. I think we've all got a bit allergic to things that look too autonomous in those circumstances. I mean, you know, if genuinely those algorithms were like a kind of sausage machine and we put in, you know, the data and out came, you've got a U at the end of the day, I don't think any of us are very happy with that set of circumstances. But again, I think we're back to augmentation. And I think that's the great thing about having this debate. And that's why, you know, I'm very pleased to be part of the Institute, for instance, because, you know, we have those debates, you have those debates in Nesta. You know, this is a live conversation. In fact, I think in the OECD, they're having debates about this kind of thing. Although I think maybe they're rather more excited about personalized education, perhaps, than you might be, Wayne.
Yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. I think there are myths around the personalized education. So if you talk to somebody in your local hostelry about, do you think personalized learning is a good thing? The answer is obviously yes. We all think personalized learning is a good thing, and so do I. But it kind of falls back to what we mean by that. And I think that one thing I think is a bit of a worry is that there's the ongoing assumption that teachers haven't been doing this for a long time. And actually that's the role of the teacher, to take the learning objectives of the day, to work with their individual students, to work out how can we build this together in a personalized way. But that I do accept that that's very challenging in a broader setting. But I think in the context of using AI in education technology, there is the story that's been mentioned many times. Sorry about that. Been mentioned many times by a CEO of a particularly large AI and education company, who likened their products to ordinary school, liking a school bus and an Uber taxi. So his logic is that standard school is like a school bus, all the children on the bus together, going the same journey together at the same speed to the same destination. And he argues that his tool is very much like an Uber taxi, because it takes every child in their own individual way. And I get that logic, but it kind of doesn't take the metaphor far enough for me, because I don't know about you, Tim, but when I get a taxi, I'm not so interested in them taking a pretty route, or a route that takes me around the sites I want to see. I generally want to take a taxi because it takes me to where I want to go. And the reality is that with most of these so-called personalized AI systems, is they don't take the individual to a personalized outcome. It's all about fitting them into really quite specific boxes. So yes, the Uber taxis are good, but it takes the students to the same bus station as the school bus.
Yes.
Like, we need to break this apart a little bit, I think.
I absolutely understand that, because I think if this is just going to become a kind of exam factory, then that is not really the destination that we want. I mean, frankly, look, if you can have people like Netflix or Amazon help you make choices by reference to your preferences, then and that's a form of AI. There is no reason why in education you can't refine things in such a way that you find the way that students learn most effectively. You know, do you better with numbers or words or diagrams, or, you know, all the sort of neurolinguistic programming type discussions that educationalists used to have. That surely, to me, is one of the ways that this can be deployed, and they can assess over a period of time. Now, I mean, there are dangers about the amassing of data and so on, and this has to be quite carefully done in terms of standards, in terms of, kite marking and procurement and all those sort of aspects of if you like, safeguarding. But at the end of the day, I think, if they can accumulate data over a period of time, after all, there could be nothing more important than education, and we allow, our music choices, our film choices, all to be determined by private companies on the web, or on an app. So there's no particular reason why this should be, off limits. We just need to make sure that we have it properly regulated.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that the slight difference is the teacher. And I think, when I go to Netflix, I don't care what anybody else thinks, it's what they recommend to me. Whereas in education, we're talking about teachers who are incredibly professional, huge amount of experience. So it's a more complex task, if you like. And I don't think we're there yet, but I do think there is potential. And you mentioned,
and I think that's a very important point. I mean, I think under any circumstances, I think we'd all be horrified if suddenly we gave over our children's education to AI, and that's it, guys. We've handed them over to AI, and we entrust it with our children's education forever and a day. That's not the way that I envisage it. This has got to be a bottom up. This has got to be done with teachers. It may start off with the very early adopters and then, spread out more widely. But, it's definitely got to be something with the absolute buy-in of the teaching profession, and with the understanding and knowledge, insofar as that's possible, of the learners as well.
Yeah, I completely agree, but I do worry that it's not top down. But when we have organizations like Google, with Google Classroom, we have organizations like Facebook who are rolling out to thousands of schools their particular version of so-called intelligent tutoring, with very little oversight, very little regulation. So can we perhaps focus down on that? I know your background, of course, is working within the law as a lawyer, I mean. And so I'm curious, from your perspective and your expertise, how can we do this? Do we leave it up to the big organization to self-regulate, or do we need a top-down? How can it work?
No, I think you've got to, at a very minimum, when you're dealing with something that's an education tool from a big tech company, or indeed from any tech company, you don't just sort of tick the terms and conditions, as if this was some kind of consumer product on your smartphone. I mean, there have to be very clear procurement rules for schools, that it has to meet essential requirements, has to be, an absolute understanding that the standards in terms of freedom from bias, explainability, all those ethical aspects that we've talked about in the past are all there. And indeed, there may be a very good case for, I just mentioned earlier, kite marking and certification, basically. So, in a way, it's very clear that they conform to standards. And I mean, this is the problem at the moment. We're slightly in the foothills of schools adopting this, and it's a little bit of a race against time. But of course, the lockdown meant that schools are scrabbling around trying to find tools for remote working, which of course then crosses over into the AI field and so on. And we're only too grateful to find that there were some tools out there being provided. But we've got to basically maybe take a little step backwards and say, well, okay, now what are the implications, and what data is being accumulated? I mean, I have very little knowledge of exactly what the sort of Google terms and conditions. I've got a much better idea of what the COVID app is collecting or not collecting than I have about the Google education tools that have been used. And and I know an awful lot of teachers actually were quite grateful. But where is that data going? Is it just being used to perfect what is being delivered, or is there something more broad that is being collected for other purposes about individual schools or individual pupils, individual students? So I think we need to know more, don't we?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's we need people with your kind of expertise to help us guide our way through that, because it is a complete maze. I think a maze is perhaps it's harder than a maze because of all the overlapping and interlocking of things. And for example, for me, one of the key things, and I keep coming back to it, is pedagogical choices, how we choose to teach our students, and the choice of a particular AI-driven tool to use in a classroom is making a particular pedagogical choice. So while we've got all the complexities around data justice and data privacy and data ownership and consent and all those things, we've also got all the things that's focused actually on the education itself, what it means and what we're trying to achieve. As you said, are we an exam factory? Are we aiming to help our young people self-actualize and become the best that they can possibly be in their own lives? And that complexity just speaks to both the dangers, but also the need for us to think quite carefully through these things, and also to try and take away some of the mythologies and understand things more carefully. For example, I'm conscious that during the COVID, we're still in the COVID, but in the early days, there was lots of talk about how students were using these new platforms or these free platforms. And actually, when we look at the data, there was a very big uplift in the number of sign-ups to these platforms, but the number of students actually using them was much, much lower. And the number of students who actually, stick with them is even lower again. So it's a complex set of issues there that we think of. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And of course, what we've got to do is get feedback. We've got to get teacher feedback, because the more evidence we get, the better these tools will be in so many ways. UCL did a paper just recently called AI for People and Planet, and they make a really important point about not only your point about the way that young people develop in terms of sort of agency and self-regulation and so on, but also about the stakeholder input into the design, which I think is so important.
I completely agree. And Tim, I would love us to continue this conversation, just the two of us, for much longer, because I'm really enjoying it, but we do have some questions coming in. So our first question in the list is from a Diana Foster, and I apologise if I pronounce your name incorrectly anyway. Is there any data being collected about the extent to which schools across the country are using AI at the moment, providing us with a centralised picture of its use? Do we know who the early adopters are, and have any trends been identified regarding geographical location, type of institution, etc.?
As far as I know, I don't think there is much being collected, quite honestly. There was, which has just, I think, come to an end in June, a sort of ed tech initiative from the Department for Education. But I have not seen anything that's pulled it all together. Some of the private sector have, but it's pulled together. And I think Nesta probably have done some work on this, Wayne, haven't they?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything from officially from government or the Office for AI or anything of that sort yet.
Yeah, so we have been working with the DfE, but the answer we've got is that it's almost impossible to know. So it mentions there, you know, we are speaking to lots of individual companies to get their figures. But the problem is that because they're commercial, they're very happy to tell us about sign-ups, and they're not so happy to tell us about actual user engagement, because that becomes a bit of a commercial secret. So we understand this, and so we are actually looking at different ways in which we can gather this data in a more robust, more automatic way so that we can do this. So they're early conversations. I think I can just say, watch this space.
Yes.
So to move on to another question then, Tim. This is from Matt Orford. Do you think the power of AI is frequently overstated? For example, the golden age of AI was back in the 50s, after which AI hit a complexity barrier which is yet to overcome. AI has enjoyed a series of AI summers and winters since.
Yes, I mean, I agree to some extent, but when we probably will get some kind of winter, but at the moment, because the power of computing is sort of keeping up with what is happening, you know, and it may be that we don't get a winter because of quantum computing coming in and so on. It does rely on huge quantities of data. I'm much more concerned about AI being held up by it only being the major tech companies having access to data, and that the more innovative, smaller startups are not getting access to data, and that then will impede innovation and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm a great believer in a sense, of being aware of what's coming down the track, so you can take account of it in terms of regulation and ethical standards and so on. We're not a sort of artificial general intelligence or anything like that, far from it, but there are many implications of the autonomous nature of AI and the fact that it learns from experience and then puts it into practice, not necessarily with human intervention. That means that you have to have a framework, an ethical framework, eventually, depending on the risk, which has regulations surrounding it. So even if we're going to have summers and winters and so on and so forth, we are moving forward. And I think that therefore there are things that, as you know, politicians, we need to be aware of. So I don't think we can just say, guys, you know, it'll fade away, and especially not with the power of the FANGs, if you like, currently.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I've mentioned to you before, Tim, and the guy called Gary Marcus, an academic in the States, he runs a big company, and a bit of an AI expert. And he says that he is a short-term pessimist about AI, but a long-term optimist. And I think I agree with that. And one of the points he makes is
I think he's actually repeating something that Turing said originally.
I think you're right.
You know, basically, it doesn't. Things don't happen as quickly in the short term, but they happen quicker in the long term. You know.
I think you're right. He adds, though, that he thinks that the current focus on data, which has brought great things, is becoming the blocker. And actually, we need to reintroduce knowledge. And so he's going back, you know, to the expert systems of the 70s and 80s. And his argument is that actually the next big step will be when these two areas come together, the data on the one hand and the human knowledge on the other. And, you know, but we're not there yet. So it's an interesting argument.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, these deep neural networks, they're pretty amazing things compared to the old expert system. And they do have that level of autonomy, which, you know, in a sense, the expert systems just can't, you know, that's one of the reasons why, you know, we had a winter, because they hit the buffers in many ways. But I do think, quite apart from that, that new forms of AI, there are what are called probabilistic forms of AI, which don't use so much data coming down the track. And, you know, there are one or two companies specializing in that, which I think is quite exciting too, because it actually helps the more fleet of foot develop new forms of AI, which actually don't depend on these huge quantities of data that sort of machine learning depends on.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to share the link to the book with you, Tim, because I'd like you to have a chat after you've read his book and then see whether that changes your views at all. Okay, going back to the questions, we've got two questions here. They're not the same, but they do address similar areas. I'll take them together. How can national legislation hope to address the ethical educational issues arising from tools provided by the multinationals operating in the area of education and AI? And that's from Tony Parkin. And then the second question, which is linked, from Hugh Davies. One of the UK's leading AI for schools developers, Century Tech, has recently gone into partnership with Capita Sims, which has personal data on every student in over 20,000 schools. Is there any ethical oversight of such developments?
Well, they both lead to the same question about the activity of the Department for Education. And, you know, they've got to wake up and start getting involved in this to a much greater extent. And I hope that, you know, the combined forces of people like Nesta, our Institute for Ethical AI in Education, and others, you know, when all this is coming together, I'm hoping that this is going to indeed set standards to insist on the way, particular ways that this technology is procured, you know, kite marking and so on and so forth. I mean, this is an absolutely, I mean, at the moment it's fallow ground, and we need to move quite fast. So I don't think there's an issue about the desirability. I think there's a question about just how proactive our department is, but Department for Education is. But sad to say, you know, the most feeble reply to our AI Select Committee came from the Department for Education. You know, and I know that, you know, people have talked about the application of AI in lifelong learning, for instance, as well. But the department doesn't even think about this in terms of, you know, conventional education, let alone in terms of the possibilities for lifelong learning. So, I mean, my response is absolutely. And, you know, Sue's question, you know, Capita, very big outfit, you know, they may well have an ethics board or whatever that helps inform what they do on this, but, you know, relying simply on an individual company, however good and however expert, doesn't seem to me to be the right way forward. If these are state schools, the state should make sure that they have oversight of this kind of potentially autonomous technology, which you know, is so important. And you know, all of us in the field, I think, would agree with that.
I completely agree with that. I think it's really, really important. And I think, you know, we've seen the history of big tech over the past, what, 15, 20 years, and the self-regulation they've worked for. And we've seen situations where, you know, when Google set up their ethical oversight board, and there was a lot of argument that this was just an approach to ethics washing. It was to avoid external regulation. But you know, on the grounds that these people, they know what they're doing and they know the best for us. But actually, they're just a small part of society, and that society much larger needs to have an opportunity to put their 2 cents into the discussion. And
I think things are moving gradually. I mean, it takes quite a lot to get this sort of public debate moving. We're finally moving, I think, on online harms, for instance, later on this year after the white paper. And, you know, let's face it, what we're trying to do is look at the opposite, i.e. what is going to be for the maximum benefit for our students. And if that, you know, doesn't need regulation, I don't know what does. I mean, we want to make sure that this technology is used for student benefit and we don't have the downsides.
Yeah, a question here, again related from Amy Matrai, again, apologies if I mispronounced that. Who gets to define the standards when it comes to commissioning commercially developed tools? How will teachers and students be given a voice? How do you envision metrics to be collected to justify and enable continuous service improvement, etc.?
Oh, again, I'm a great believer in bottom-up solutions. You know, only, you know, tools are going to develop over time, depending on the context in which they're operated. And if you don't have a user group or you know, a stakeholder group or whatever, you're missing a huge number of tricks. This has got to be, you know, part of the warp and the weft of education, basically, both with teachers and with students. You know, feedback is the lifeblood of innovation, basically. So that's got to happen. So I don't see any conflict. I just think that if people think that all you do is arrive with a package and you know, and it's all top down, well, they're going to make a huge mistake, and ultimately it's not going to be effective because human beings, being what they are, you've got to adapt to them. You can't just have a one size fits all.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that, you know, that there are big issues that I think don't get considered. So you touched earlier on the notion of consent, and I think, you know, when a young person is in a school environment and they're interacting with an AI tool, the question is, A, has that young person given consent? Has their parent given consent?
Yeah.
We really know, is that informed consent when it's potentially a long document they might have to read and try to understand?
Well, you're back absolutely into the realm of public trust, you know, and it's fundamental to the whole of AI development, basically. And it's something that we spent quite a lot of time discussing, and I still spend an awful lot of time discussing at every level. If you look at the OECD, the Council of Europe, the EU, the G20, you know, it's all about trying to make sure that, in a sense, we have the license to innovate by having public trust. Because if we don't have public trust, we then get ab reactions, we get a kind of, you know, anti-technology sentiment, which, you know, it can't be necessarily beneficial. I mean, it is if it's sort of harmful technology, but beneficial technology, obviously, we want to make sure does have public acceptance. Now, you can only get public acceptance if you make sure that the context in which it's applied is correct in terms of the ethics and the standards and the way that you approach consent, Wayne. You're absolutely right. But it's something we should all be passionate about, because we are fighting a narrative here. We have a kind of historical narrative that technology is malign in some respects. You only have to go back to Homer to see, you know, Telos stomping round the Isle of Crete. And you know, the myth there was that he was this pretty unpleasant robot, basically, that Jason and the Argonauts managed to disable. Well, you know, we've got 3,000 years of history or myth that we're trying to counteract here. And so we've got to be extremely firm and careful about how we go about things.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that yeah, I've been involved in lots of attempts, conversations where the technology sector have been saying, how do we get people to trust us, as if the onus is on the people doing the trusting. Whereas actually, well, the best way to get people to trust you is to do and be trustworthy. And it's a trite thing to say, but I think that's the bit that gets missed. And yeah, when we have some of the mythologies that grow up around what AI can do, when we know it can't, and when AI does some of the things that it shouldn't be doing, such as around the biases and face recognition and so on and so forth, that really fundamentally undermines the trust. And so that's why I think it's really important that we narrow down on what AI can do and make sure that it does what it can do well, and in ways that actually take into account the needs and worries and confidences of people.
Yeah, and of course, the trouble is people always remember the worst examples. I mean, whether or not it was AI, people are going to remember the A-level algorithm for a very long time. And, you know, it's given AI and algorithms a very bad name for quite some time to come. And there are plenty of other, you know, public service algorithms which are not doing anybody any favors as well. So we've got to move quite smartly to get things right.
I agree, and we must remember the role of the human beings. Human beings make the choices to they write the algorithm, they apply the algorithm, they choose to interpret the algorithm in a particular way. So it's not this thing out there, it's all part of humanity. And to come back to the questions, I'm conscious of time. We have a question here from Andrew Whittington Davis, who says, does AI run the risk in widening the educational gap between the rich and poor? If so, how do we make sure this new technology is experienced by all and not just the few? I think that's a really important set of questions.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And that's my vision for the use of AI, is actually to level up. It's to use it for social mobility in education. That's why if you have a department for education that is not really very forward-looking and is not looking at AI in this context, well, they're missing a massive opportunity. And, it'll be our private schools who get everything, all the resource and all the development and, all this kind of thing. And I'm not against private schools doing well, but I'm very, very much in favor of our state schools delivering a fantastic education so that people have all the life chances that they can get, from whatever background. So yeah, it's an issue, but you can only do it by government action in education. I mean, that's the interesting thing. The possibilities for positive action are so great in this area, and it's ironic that actually we may have an AI strategy, we've got a sector deal, we've got an office for AI, we've got the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, but we don't seem to have, we have an NHSX, which is, in many ways promoting artificial intelligence in some of its applications. Where is the Department for Education?
Yeah, yes, I think we could talk about it a long time. Okay, going back to the questions, Tim, we have one from Jay Alexander here who asked, what are your thoughts regarding bias in AI when applied in education?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the big issues, because currently, although, and we've got people like Sue from Tech UK who can probably say more about these kinds of things, but we don't yet quite have all the tools that we need to detect bias in training and bias in, if you like, collection and so on, and then outputs. We don't yet have all the tools that we need. They are sort of under development, if you like. And this is one of the issues about, setting the standards and so on. So I'm a great believer in, if you like, what the IEEE call ethically aligned design. So as far as possible, you design up front, you make, you try and make sure that the data is as unbiased as possible up front. So, it's like trying to jump on a moving train otherwise. And so I'm a great believer in transparency and ethical design up front, if humanly possible, when you're designing these AI solutions. But we're still not there. Our historic data, I have no doubt, the education area is pretty biased, but because it's been collected in random ways over the years, and actually probably what the data sets we do have are pretty poorly organized, I should imagine. So it's only, again, we're back to the big companies that have put this together, for their own purposes. I don't know what the sort of publicly available data sets would be, but I suspect that, they're not really fit for purpose in that respect.
And I'm conscious of time, Tim, and we've got a bunch of other questions that people have kindly asked. I'm just going to try and answer a couple of more. This one is from, and again, I'm going to mispronounce your surname, I'm sorry, Louis Coiffet. I'm so sorry, I'll probably done that badly. Anyway, what's unique about the application of AI in education versus other fields? There's something about those who are not yet adults, but what else?
Oh, well, I mentioned lifelong learning earlier. I mean, I think, and of course, many of the issues that surround students who are, minors and so on, doesn't quite apply to adults in a way. You've got to hope that they will have a greater understanding of what they're using. But I mean, I think as a resource, especially for, if you like, autonomous learning for an individual, I think that the possibilities are pretty big, actually, in the future. But of course, it's very closely tied to the need for lifelong learning, because we're all going to have to develop new skills. So in a funny sort of way, it's going to be a circular thing. We're probably going to have to use AI in order to learn skills that will help us live with AI, basically. I mean, I know your book, for instance, is divided into two parts. You know, one is, if you like, the implications of AI for our future education and skills, and the other is how we use AI to educate. Well, you know, I think the lifelong learning aspect could use AI in order to help us remain agile as we move through life, having maybe 4 or 5 different careers as a result of the changes in technology as time goes on.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in my work, I talk about 3 connections between AI and education. One is learning with AI. So these are the tools we've been talking about. One is learning about AI. And I think that's a fundamental thing that our education system is not doing well enough on. The university sector, they're doing a brilliant job, but preparing young people to enjoy those possible study areas and careers, that's not happening a great deal. And the third area is, it's not a great name, but learning for AI, by which I mean learning to live in a world where AI is becoming increasingly dominant. And what does that mean for us? So, you know, making people aware about things like fake news, for example, not the Donald Trump version, but the actual version where bots are creating news items, or where deep fakes, where faces are being put on wrong people to say things that they didn't really say. So I think that's a whole realm of education that is fundamentally important, that we've got to be using the skills of our teachers and more broadly to help everybody across our society to better understand the reality of the AI and not get tied up in these silly myths, but actually what are the real things it can do, both in terms of the benefits, but also awareness of the things that, you know, are perhaps not so beneficial. Okay, moving on to the questions, because time is running very, very quickly. I think this one is from Luca Travlot. Again, apologies. Anyway, Lord Clement-Jones spoke about the use of AI to support social mobility and levelling up. So could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, really, it's a question of making the best use of the resource you've got. So, you know, on the basis that teachers are a scarce resource and our class sizes are quite big, then if you can actually harness the benefit of AI for teachers' use and for learners' use, then you're making the best use of that limited resource. And it seems, because, you know, let's face it, as we know in private education, they've got the privilege of class sizes of 15 and so on and so forth. So I think it stands to reason that if you got this right, you could use this as a tool to improve the education in the state sector, in a sense, open opportunity for the students in the state sector. Now, I know that sounds a little bit utopian, but that's what technology can do. It can enhance and it can augment what we do. I'm a believer in technology. After all, most of us in our lives are the beneficiary of technology. I mean, we're probably doing things that 10 years ago we wouldn't have dreamt that we would be doing. Certainly, I never dreamt that I would be engaged in Zoom on an hourly basis in my working day. So I do think there are great prospects for it, but it just has to be, you know, very clear about how we use it. And the social purpose of these tools is, for me, extremely important. They're not value free. They have to be for benefit. They have to be for learners' benefit, and they have to have the buy-in from our teaching profession.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Again, I'm in full agreement. We've got 2 last questions, or 2 last questioners. One is, again, apologies, I'm trying so hard, Feras Al-Omari, who's asked two questions. One is, can you give examples of pedagogy uses? And I think that's come out through our conversation. But more importantly, is there any data sharing used today on education worldwide? And I think, again, this builds on what we said before, that there isn't actually a great deal of data.
No.
So, but it's some work I'm doing with UNESCO, and I think the work that Tim mentioned with OECD, attempts are happening, but they are very, very early days, and we do need to get a better handle on this. But the last question for you, Tim, if I, oh, it's just disappeared. Okay, so we had a, hang on, so I can find it again, from someone called Austin. Austin, does it seem likely that regulation is viable for technologies that are widely adopted by individual choice without the need for state sanction? One will be left regulating only those technologies get sold to schools, virtually guaranteed to be less effective than those that prove themselves in the consumer marketplace. And just to point out, Tim, you have got literally 30 seconds to answer that really easy question.
I think there's a huge difference between what you adopt for your personal use, which I as an adult might take on my iPad or my iPhone, and what is actually institutionalized within our schools. So I think there's a very different set of regulations involved. You know, you're talking about young people who, if they got the wrong technology applied, could actually have, you know, harmful effects for the rest of their lives in their formative years. So I think you've got to be extra careful, extra regulatory, if you like, in that young period. But I think you can loosen the brakes a bit later on when you're talking about individual, essentially consumer choice.
Okay, Tim, we're about to get to the top of the hour, as they say. So your last thought, your parting thought, what do you want people to think about?
I think it's interesting where we've got to in our conversation, Wayne. I think, you know, we're both agreed that if only we could get a sensible framework for AI, there are a lot of possibilities. And I love the idea of building up individual qualities as part of that education process, which is really what it's all about. You know, it's the root of the word education, educare, drawing out basically those qualities that will help people succeed in life. That's really important. But I don't think we've got a Department for Education that's really proactive in this respect. So maybe we all ought to make a resolution that we kick lords and masters in the Department for Education rather hard to do something.
And on that note, Tim, thank you so much for giving us your time today on this. It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm looking forward to many more discussions. And also thank you to everybody who asked a question. If I missed anybody, I'm really, really sorry, but really grateful for the questions. It's been a fabulous discussion. So Tim, thank you very, very much. And
thank you very much, Wayne. Really good conversation.
Cool, thank you. And bye-bye for now. Bye-bye, everybody.